In many ways, this could be the longest lesson we would ever have because we're talking about a time that we could even order in the millions of years compared to the few thousand that we look at with history. But it will not be the longest lesson. Indeed, we'll get through this kind of quickly. This is an overview of lessons 1, 2, and 3 that we've done in class. There are some questions that we're going to answer, and here are the questions right here. I'll go over them in a second. You could answer these one of two ways. You could put them in your notebook, write them down, and then take a picture of your notebook and upload it as your assignment. Or I do have a Google Doc with these very same questions on here that are attached below this assignment, and you could open that and answer. The advantage of writing it is you could write as you watch the video, or you could split screen. It's up to you, but I want you to answer these questions. So question 1 is, what is prehistory and how is it divided by anthropologists? These are social scientists that study humanity. And what makes prehistory prehistory? And how do we see the general nature of all human societies in our early Paleolithic ancestors? And why did humans develop farming? That's a very important question. And how did farming generate a slow chain reaction of events that would increase the complexity of human communities? Now, if you remember the picture of our friends Yanomami who living in Venezuela and Brazil, you notice their societies are very, very simple, actually. And you compare them to the complexity of the modern society that you and I live in. How was farming part of the genesis or the energy that put that into play? What are the characteristics of civilization and how did farming make these possible? Again, that's in the reading, although I combined a few of them to make it a bit simpler. And why was writing such an important human society? If you could read this, you need to thank early civilizations because they're the ones who developed this idea. Okay, so let's talk about the dawn of human history. Remember at the beginning of the year, I asked you guys to fathom the question, when did history begin? And historians look at this in different ways. Prehistory is a time before human communities. It could be recorded, it could be written. Anything that's before humans were able to write and reflect on their own life is considered prehistory. The only way we know about prehistoric people is by what we could dig up through archaeologists and paleontologists that look at old forms of life, bones, anthropologists who look at early human societies, can trace human societies back to 2.5 million years ago, although those humans would be kind of unrecognizable. They were not humans, but hominids would be unrecognizable as humans to us. They were kind of human ancestors. But about 600,000 years ago, less than a million years ago, we see the first Homo sapiens, and they were in Africa. But we're not going to be focusing a lot on the biology of human evolution, which is something more for a biology class. But we're more interested in humans and their culture and societies. So we know that for our purposes, anthropologists divide human history into prehistory into two eras, the Paleolithic, and paleo means old, lithic means stone, so the Paleolithic is the old Stone Age. The most important thing you need to know about this society, beside the fact it was enormously long, is that humans developed the first societies and they were hunters and gatherers, like the Yanomamo still are today. So in some ways, the Yanomamo are living examples of Paleolithic humanity. And then we had the Neolithic, New Stone Age, which we see development of farming and domestication. We'll look at that in a little bit. Now, so here's your first question, and you can write the answer down. What is prehistory? How is it divided by anthropologists? And what makes prehistory prehistory? Hold on, you might have, if you have trouble with that, we'll clarify that later, but at least get that first piece done. Okay, once you got that done, let's take a look at the second issue here. And what were Paleolithic societies like? Humans evolved as pack animals, and we still are packs today, and our packs are often called nations or cultures. But in the earliest societies, they were bands of about 20 to 40 people. Everybody in your society knew each other. You knew them when names developed by name. You knew them personally. Unlike in our societies today, like America with 330 million people, we only know a small fraction of those members who share our common American society. A very key term in this idea of packs, why humans survive in packs, is because they become interdependent. Interdependent is a characteristic in human societies where the activities and actions of one person are dependent on the actions and activities of another. So you have a small group of hunters within the community, and they're out trying to bring a monkey or maybe something bigger in to eat. If they fail, the band goes hungry. If they succeed, the band gets fed. So interdependence means that people are not solitary animals looking for their own food, but they're generally working in groups. Same is true with shelter, and eventually things like medicine and art are things that were done interdependently, not by one person acting independently, but by a number of people sharing common ideas and attitudes. The earliest human societies were in these groups of about 20 to 40. They were pretty organic. And we know from looking at the Yanomamo, who lived like Paleolithic people, that when the group reached more than 40, then groups of them will leave and form their own communities. But population generally is growing very slowly. Lifespans are relatively short. Fertility is pretty uncertain because of the lack of prenatal kind of care and medicine. So these populations, like the populations of our earliest ancestors, grew very slowly or oftentimes would decline. A disease moving into a community could wipe it out. Where if the band gets too small, then it's not going to be large enough to survive. So a key question I want you to think about was what might be necessary to keep a group of 20 to 40 people working together. Now, biologically, they'd share hunger, so of course hunger would put them all on the same page. They better get something to eat. But the very act of hunting, particularly larger animals which could feed a lot of people, required that hunters would have to maybe develop and pass on techniques of hunting to their children and grandchildren. It's not just an instinct. The idea of how do you organize something as sophisticated as a snare, how do you fashion the spear, or how do you surround an animal that's much larger than you folks are. So things like building pitfalls, using fire, these are all types of things that human societies developed. And interestingly enough, unlike animals, they would be able to pass them down generation to generation, particularly when the development of spoken language made that possible. We think that humans developed basic spoken language maybe as recently as 80,000 years ago. We know that our hominid ancestors had some cousins. You may have heard of Neanderthals, for example. There are older forms of humanity, but we're interested in, or hominids, I should say, but we're really interested in Homo sapiens sapiens, and that's biologically everyone in our classroom, as far as I know. As these people, we know that the theory is out of Africa. We see the earliest Homo sapiens sapiens leaving Africa. On this map, they say as early as 120,000 years before, or maybe as recently as 75,000 years before the Common Era. And of course, as they range, they're not like using a map and saying, well, how do we get to London? I mean, what they're doing is they're following animal herds. And empty land meant there was no other human communities to compete with them. And of course, you can't support a lot of hunters and gatherers in land versus farmers or industrial societies. So these people required a pretty large range. And over a period of tens of thousands of years, you could see humans would move into India, into Southeast Asia, into the Far East. And if you take a look up here, you can see as recently as about 13,000 years ago, people left East Asia and came to the Americas. That's where they're heading off to. And it's interesting to note that over the periods of tens of thousands of years, the people up here kind of developed biological traits that are good for a lack of sunlight. Lighter skin, for example, blue eyes, lighter colored hair, a narrower nasal cavity to heat the air. People in Asia developed a different skin color too, based on their environment, the features that we might call Asiatic today. And if you notice, for example, American Indians share a lot of the biological features of East Asians. That would tell you the reason why is because those cultures kind of broke apart only 13,000 years ago. You can see 13,000 years here. So the idea is the time of diversion or breaking apart from people in East Asia and those who became the ancestors of American Indians was about 13,000 years ago. But the break apart of people in Asia from those who moved into Europe was 40 or 50,000 years ago. So their biology is going to drift further, and our culture will drift further because they broke apart at an earlier age. You can see, though, that some areas like in New Zealand or Madagascar, it was as late as about 1000 CE, less than 1,000 years ago, that our first human ancestors entered these inhabitable islands. We call this the peopling of the earth. Now, humans are spreading about the world and they're developing new ways to adapt to new environments. And one of the hallmarks of human society is the ability to innovate. Stone tools grow more sophisticated later in the Paleolithic age. Language would be developed to aid interdependence, and the interdependence would support the survival of the bands, and successful bands would live to pass on their cultural traits to younger generations. And with spoken language, the idea of being able to communicate something beyond pointing is going to allow for the more sophisticated retention of knowledge. No writing yet, but with spoken words, ideas that are more complex are able to be shared. Religion emerged as humans saw nature as separate from themselves, and they had somehow had to understand it and how to master it. This is a fertility goddess, I guess you might be able to tell, a female figure. And Paleolithic people really valued fertility. It made the land fertile, it made their animals fertile, it made their families fertile. So they would worship and try to manipulate things like anything that they thought would help them have a better life. And that's generally where religion comes from. It's an attempt to try to understand the forces of nature. And if you study some of the earliest religions, you see some strong aspects of science in there. For example, it's the priests of early societies that would develop things like calendars that we see as measuring the time when to harvest and when to plant. Those things are very important. So this is actually question two. We have to fix this. How do we see the general nature of all human societies and our early Paleolithic ancestors? How were Paleolithic ancestors like something that they set the foundation for all human societies that would follow? Think in terms of functions and organization and practices that we still use today. Okay, you could stop the video, answer this question, and then move on. Okay, now, the dawn of agriculture. Agriculture is going to be one of the most important innovations that anthropologists have been able to find in human prehistory. We think it might have been caused by climate change. Changing environments made it harder to find enough food. Many people would starve, but a few groups would learn, for example, that by planting or dropping seeds, they could have a more dependable source of food. Or by selecting animals or enclosing wild animals into a place, they would have a reliable supply of animals when they need them. They could even selectively breed the animals, growing their herds, and that learned that they could use things like wool or milk. Of course, you can't milk a wild cow. So the idea of selectively breeding and taking things from the animals to help support the primary need of societies of providing food, we see this. Animals like cows and sheep provide products, but they also provide meat. But animals like dogs and cats and oxen and horses would also be used to assist human societies. Like, for example, why dogs? Well, think about a society that has to protect itself from wild animals or from each other. A society that might still have hunting as a way to kind of augment their diet. Dogs are very important for that. Cats, well, we talk about these people who are growing grain, and of course, the big enemy to a grain store are mice. So we could see that cats could be used to kind of protect valuable grain stores from mice. You know that if the mice get into your granary, you starve to death. Now, there are only a few societies left on Earth who live like our pre-agricultural ancestors, and we saw that at the beginning of class, the Yanomamo. Again, I want you to remember these people because in some ways we're looking at a common lifestyle that our ancestors all survived. Again, their survival is pretty definite since the fact that we're all here today. So this is the next question. Why did humans develop farming? What was the purpose of farming? What did it do? Remember, they weren't reading a textbook and says, okay, we need to develop farming right now. They simply were reacting to a changing world, and the adaptations they made were successful. If it wasn't successful, we wouldn't be here. And because it was successful, they would pass it down to their children and grandchildren, gradually improving it to the agriculture that we have today. Okay, now let's take a look at this, farming and the path to human history. How did agriculture create something we would call civilization? Please remember this key that agriculture, the development of farming, both provided the possibility, it made it possible, and the necessity, It made it absolutely necessary for it to happen. These complex societies that would come